And welcome back. Time to open the phones. Let's go first to Sherry in Ocala, Florida. Good morning to you.
Good morning to you, and thank you for having me on your show.
You're most welcome.
Thank you to your guests. I called the governor, and I followed the Florida alimony reform that was in place. I had asked the governor to veto it, and my son, who is a disabled young adult, also asked the governor to veto it. Right now, I've been in a long-term marriage, many children, over 20 years of marriage. I also have a disability. With my disability, there was a settlement which those funds, part of them were used toward promoting my husband further in his career. And, with the alimony reform, the way it was written, I didn't feel that it gave equal protection under the law. Yes, I was a stay-at-home mom for many years. In fact, in the mediation for this settlement, when they calculated what I did within my household, I actually, the value of service was double to what my husband earned at that time.
You know, someday our work in the home is going to be calculated. Cheryl.
Well, I often ask people whether or not their spouse works outside the home, because certainly they do work inside the home. We all know. But I agree with your statements very much, which is why I, too, believe having limitations on alimony is a significant concern to people. Those who make the choice, normally it's a joint choice to have one parent stay home with children for a significant period of time, don't realize at the time, or do realize and are willing to accept the consequence of that the ability to further their career, even if they do become, quote, rehabilitated, as Judge Sun says, whatever that might mean, simply do not have the capability to earn the same type of income of those who continue on in their career through the young children stages of marriage. And it cannot be replicated. You can't make it up. So unless and until there is some value placed on that by society or by maximizing earnings later, and unless and until there's some way of dealing with people who, like you, have children who are special needs and as a result have limitations in their ability to work outside the home, having a consequence that is absolute, 10 years or 15 years, no matter what, I think is arbitrary and capricious and will result in consequences that will be staggering for our society.
All right, here's an email for Warren Farrell. What are your thoughts on how long alimony should be if one of the individuals in the divorced relationship is permanently disabled and collects SSDI?
Yeah, I think that in cases like that, there should be flexibility to, permanence of alimony shouldn't be like knocked out of the law, but it should certainly be an aspiration for all of us to avoid whenever we can. Long-term dependency really does create a bad psychology. I think something that I would like to address here is, what we all really want is to prevent the whole divorce from occurring to begin with. And then I think we also have an interest in and I think the way to deal with that is in school we teach algebra, trigonometry, calculus, but we don't teach communication. And the part of communication that we don't teach at all is how to handle personal criticism from a loved one without becoming defensive. And that's a skill set that almost the Achilles heel of human beings is our inability to handle personal criticism, particularly from loved ones.
And Warren, is
yes, go ahead.
A whole program of its own, which at some point I do hope we can take up. Here's an email from Peter who says, when military people get divorced, their spouses get ownership of part of the service member's retirement. This isn't alimony that can be set or adjusted by the court. It's permanent ownership, as though it were a tangible piece of property. Is this changing, Cheryl?
Well, I don't think it's going to change. Actually, the states determined early on that there should be some fair distribution of marital property, either community property division, which is almost always 50-50, or equitable distribution, which could be something other than 50-50. This issue was actually addressed by the United States Supreme Court, and the court determined that military retirement is an asset to be divided upon divorce, just like any other retirement would be. And generally, it's divided on a formula of if, as, and when for a portion of the military service during the marriage.
I see. A few emailers are asking Ann Sunt to explain the difference between alimony and child support, and what about prenuptial agreements?
Oh my gosh, where do I begin? I'm in favor of prenuptial agreements.
You are.
I am. Even if the agreements are never upheld, even if they're ripped up and thrown away, it means at least that youngsters entering into this relationship have given it some thought. And I think that's a very wise thing to do, particularly with more and more households where there are both parents working.
Indeed.
But child support is a whole different factor. I mean, alimony impacts child support, and that's another piece of this, because we have child support guidelines, and into those guidelines go the incomes of both parties, and if one is paying the other one some alimony, that changes the whole child support scheme. The interesting parallel is one that I think you or Cheryl mentioned earlier. We have an automatic cutoff of child support. And all of us know, either within our own households or we have friends whose adult children are not self-supporting.
Beyond the age of 18? Really?
19 if they're in high school.
Absolutely.
So we don't just throw them out on the street. We continue, but there's no legislative requirement that we do that. So go ahead.
Let's go to Montgomery, New Jersey. Good morning, Stuart.
Good morning. Thank you so much for addressing this important issue on your show. My question would be for the past president of the AAML. My question to you is, I'd like you to reconcile what you're saying here today with the AAML 2007 report, which recommended durational guidelines for alimony because of the fact that there is no predictability with unlimited discretion with judges and no guidelines at all.
Cheryl.
I'm glad you brought that up, Stuart, because it was on my checklist for me to be sure to mention here today. The American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers years ago, as you say, in 2007, I believe, came up with guidelines in great part because we were concerned about the significant disparity in lifestyles that were afforded when women were not afforded a reasonable amount of support. Again, we today are not limiting this to women. I know that we started out with some statistics that indicated that there are few men who receive support alimony. It's mostly women who are receiving it. But I assure you that 10 years from now, that statistic will be changed, especially as a result of same-sex marriages. And the fact that same-sex couples are raising children together, and one of them, sometimes both, will spend considerable time rearing their children. But when we came up with the guidelines, they were meant to be guidelines. They were not affected by any state that I'm aware of in the union adopting them. In fact, in Maryland, they are to be considered by the court as just one of many factors to give guidance. That was the purpose of them. That's what they were meant to be. And because the guidelines, of course, were meant to be considered by all 50 states, and because income can be significantly variable in some states vis-a-vis others, it's a lot more expensive to live, for example, in the Manhattan area than it might be, for example, in Arkansas. It was never intended that those guidelines were going to be just adopted.
All right, here's an email from Bonnie, who says there is too much abuse in alimony and modifications are too rare, and the addition of effectively forcing a new spouse to pay for someone's previous spouse is unconscionable, as that person may still be reeling from a previous divorce themselves. Alimony is properly and too rarely used as a lifeline to the future. Ann Sund.
I'm not sure which part of this I agree with, but a good deal of it, because as I started out by saying, I try very hard to look for some other alternative. I see alimony the same way I see the court. It's a last resort. Most people do resolve their differences, and they work it out, and then they take responsibility and ownership for their own contracts. The people who come to court, for whatever reason, can't do that or won't do it, and so a third party does it for them. Alimony is a little bit like that. If there's some other way to untangle the relationship, to make sure that everybody is fairly treated, the parties will find that, given suggestions, opportunities. And it's only when they can't do that a third party has to make a decision.
All right, let's go to Barrington, Rhode Island. Let's hear from David. Good morning to you.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Sure.
It's a really complicated and complex topic, but one of the guests, and she just mentioned that most seem to get settled before they get to court. In my experience, based on all the friends that I know that have gone through this very difficult process, is that they usually do all end up in court. And you take something that is sort of an emotional contract and you kind of fit it into this legalistic contract, and it seems to perpetuate this this adversarial process. And I'm just wondering how they see maybe the courts kind of bringing a little more compassion or something into the system so that it seems to be a fair process even when they do get to court. Because my experience is that most end up in court, and I don't know where the guest recites the information or the data that says that most are settled before they get to court.
David, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
Did you turn to a mediator before you got to court?
I personally, we did try to do that, and we were moving along in that process. But I found that once we got into the legal system, that in some ways the legal system almost perpetuated the animosity that kind of grew out of it. And I'm wondering if that's true. If you have children, if it becomes more adverse because children add a whole other dynamic to it.
Indeed.
Let me add something here, if I may.
All right, hold on 1 second, just to remind listeners that you are listening to the Diane Rehm Show